Welcome to the Health in Motion podcast. I am your host, Evie. I am a functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner who loves to help people achieve their wellness goals they once thought were impossible to reach. I am the owner of Holistically Restored, and through my coaching practice, I have been able to guide my clients through their own health journeys and teach them to truly understand their body. With a focus on hormone, thyroid, and weight management, I strive to instill the knowledge, confidence, and encouragement everyone deserves. If you enjoy this content, I'd love for you to subscribe and also leave a review on Apple Podcast. Please tell your friends, family, or anyone who is curious about bettering themselves in a holistic way. The more, the merrier. Please keep in mind this podcast is created for educational purposes only and is not to be taken as medical advice. I am so happy you're here and ready to learn. Let's do it. Hello, everybody. Before we dive into today's episode, I wanted to do a quick little intro to give you background information and the background story on cold plunges and how this came about. Because as you'll hear, when Toréa and I are talking, we're kind of talking more present day, benefits of cold plunging and so forth. So I wanted to give you background as to why this is even an episode on the Health in Motion podcast. If you have followed me on social media, then you know that I am obsessed, and I'm going to say literally obsessed with cold plunges. I actually just did one this morning. It was the first one that I had done in a while, and it felt really good. I mean, obviously it was hard, but it felt really good. I'm going to talk about that euphoric high that you feel afterwards, and I'm just now like kind of coming down from that, and it's been like an hour. I'm also just now coming back to regular body temperature, so still feeling the effects of the cold plunge. But I wanted to talk about them because one, I love them, and two, they've become really popular. I think so in mainstream media, I guess, or you're just seeing more of it. And the more I talk to people, they're like, yeah, like I keep seeing things about like cold plunge and cold therapy. And so this just felt appropriate. I also feel like this is appropriate because on the day that this episode comes out, it is going to be the 1-year anniversary of my first ever cold plunge. So that feels kind of special to me because before I even started them and, I had signed up to do it, I was like, oh, this will probably be like a one-time thing. I don't really know how I'm going to feel. And the fact that I've been doing them for a year feels pretty cool. So the backstory to this is that I attended a breathwork workshop in April of 2021. So again, a year ago, which was completely out of my comfort zone because, one, it was the first outing that I had done since COVID started. Two, I was putting myself in a room full of people who I felt like were smarter than me. And so I felt like an imposter for even being in the same room as these people. And three, I could potentially look like an idiot in front of these strangers. And I was like, what if I bail? And I just didn't want to look stupid. I mean, I think we can all relate to that. So surprise, I survived to tell the tale and I absolutely loved it. The workshop consisted of breath work. So, you kind of need to know how to breathe before you get into a stressful situation. And then we got to hang out in the sauna and try the cold plunge afterwards. So we all did, like the group did the breath work together. And then we split and my friend and I did the sauna first and then we did the cold plunge after. And since then I've actually reversed that. I've done like cold first, then hot. So I've kind of played around and I'll talk about which one I like in this actual episode. So I will say that spending the time to learn how to breathe was really, really important. And if you're curious why I say I learned how to breathe, then you should go back and listen to the Breathwork Basics episode on this podcast. It was episode 20. We talk about the difference between respirating, which is what you're doing now, and breathing. So in order to put myself into a stressful situation, aka cold ass water, and survive that, I knew that I needed to learn how to breathe through it. So I really liked that that was the order of that workshop. So we spent a lot of time breathing, talking about the mechanics of breath, why to do it, different types, and then we put ourselves in that situation to utilize those skills that we had learned. So it has been 1 year of doing the cold plunges. So this episode feels very special to me. Adding in this health activity, or I just don't love like the health hacks, like, or biohacking. Like, I know this technically falls under that, but I don't know. I just don't like saying that. I think this is a health modality or activity. I don't know. So adding this to my life has really brought about some cool changes for me personally, professionally. I'd say mentally, physically, and it has opened doors to a lot of opportunities for me, which is why I'm so grateful for that initial workshop. And I'm just so thankful that this seems to be something that people are interested in, because every time I post about it, people are like, or, DMing me like, oh, like, how did you do that? Or what'd you do that? Or how long did you stay in? Or how cold does it have to be? So I'm like, all right, let's just do a podcast episode on this. So in this episode, we're going to talk about what is cold exposure? What does it even mean? What are the benefits of it? When and how to do it? And a few other details too. So Toréa and I dive into it. I brought Toréa on because one, she's amazing and awesome. And two, she has now started doing cold plunges as well. So I thought it'd be cool if we talk about our experiences. And also, as most of you know, and if you don't know, now you will, Toréa and I actually co-host the Wildly Optimized Wellness podcast. So that's a brand new podcast. We just finished season 1. And we're actually going to do a crossover episode. So what you hear today is also being crossed over into another episode on the Wildly Optimized Wellness podcast, which that'll be out in early May. So just a few more weeks until season 2 starts. And so we're going to start season 2 with the cold exposure. And in that episode, we actually talk a little bit more about doing this out in nature, which is really cool because obviously that episode or that podcast, we try and focus in on doing as many things out in nature as possible, right? Out in the wild. So be sure to listen to that. So in a couple weeks, I will obviously be posting about that and sharing that, but keep that in mind that Wildly Optimized Wellness has another crossover episode with this episode in just a few weeks. So as always, again, remember, this is not for everybody. Main things to look out for with cold exposure is obviously if you're pregnant, that's a no-go. If you have concerns with blood pressure, that's another big one. So if you have questions about whether this is right for you and you feel like you need to consult with your doctor, do that, right? I'm always sharing that. It's important. It's very individualized. So that's the intro. I'm really excited to dive into this. So here we go.
All right. So let's talk about our obsession then. So Toréa, thank you for joining me today. I'm so excited to have you back. And obviously, you're one of my favorite people ever. And so I feel so grateful that you're here spending time with me talking about cold exposure, especially now that you've been doing this yourself.
So, yes, I am so excited to come back and talk to you about this. And thank you so much for having me on this podcast again. And I guess we just can't stop talking with each other, huh?
No. And I think people like it too, which is good. And one thing, again, I mentioned this earlier, and this is in the show notes as well, but again, this is a crossover episode. So what you're hearing in this episode, there's more information on this going to be in the Wildly Optimized Wellness podcast episode as well. So this particular episode that you're listening to now, depending on when you're listening to it, is coming out before that one. But just know that if you're listening to this weeks after, then you probably have access to both immediately. So once you finish this one, go and listen to the one on Wildly Optimized. We're going to dive deeper into cold exposure and specifically in nature and the natural free resources that we have for that. So I'm excited to be able to talk about both of those things and do this crossover with you.
Oh, it's going to be a ton of fun.
Yeah. So I think there's a few kind of big, heavy hitter questions that we need to go over, right? I think we need to talk about what is cold exposure, the benefits of it. And, you're more well-versed in some of them than I am. And so we're going to just kind of tag team, those benefits and also share what we've noticed, because now that we've been doing these, we can absolutely say that we've noticed a benefit. So I think
Absolutely.
It's good to dive into that. And then also talk about the difference between cold water immersion versus cold showers, cryotherapy, because that's a question I get a lot. Anytime I talk about doing cold plunges or ice baths, I always have at least one person ask, well, what's the difference between that and cryotherapy? Which one's better? So we'll talk about that as well. And we have some research to show, benefits between those two and also which one would potentially be harder. And then we're going to get into just real basics of when and how to do this. Because that's also a question that I get a lot of, well, when do you do this? What time of day? Or how did you even get into this? So again, as you heard in the beginning, I shared my story as to how I got into all this. And Toréa, I'd love to hear from you how you decided to get into cold therapy. So let's start with that actually. What has your experience been with cold plunges and cold water immersion? And tell me all the things about that.
Okay, well, 100% I blame you. So we're just going to get that off of the table right there. Actually, cold immersion and cold water therapy and cryotherapy has piqued my interest for a number of years, but I have to admit, I've been a complete chicken shit about it. Like, there's no way I was going to get myself into a very cold situation. And part of that has to do with the fact that one of my autoimmune diagnoses that I've had in my past, or still have, or whatever the status is the Raynaud's syndrome. So Raynaud's syndrome causes the blood vessels in your fingers and your toes to constrict completely and cut off all of circulation to those digits. And so when you look down and have completely white fingers that look like ghosts, it's quite frightening. So I didn't want to induce any kind of Raynaud's attack, if you will. So I've kind of like blown it off. But you inspired me to just put my toe in the water, if you will, and just experiment with it. And I've really been blown away with how I feel and some of the results that I've seen and some of the metrics that I track, both on my Oura Ring, and I also wear a continuous glucose monitor because I'm that geeky and that nerdy about this kind of data. And I've just been really pleased with the results. And now I'm kind of addicted. I do it all the time.
I know. I tell people, like, hey, if I'm going to be addicted to something, then I'll take the cold plunge. Like, that's fine. So yeah. And I can't wait for you to share what you've noticed just like from your own body, you know, right? Like the blood sugar things and scores on your Oura Ring. And we'll get into that too. But I think we just need to start with what is cold exposure. And you're going to find definitions all over the place. And I think most people understand, like, cold exposure means you're exposing yourself to cold. But what I'm really saying is, in my definition of it, instead of getting very sciencey and technical, is cold exposure is defined by exposing yourself to temperature that is, it makes you feel like, wow, this is really cold, really, really cold, but I'm not in danger. That's how I would define it. Of, you're like, holy shit, this is really cold. This is uncomfortable. Why am I doing this? But I'm also not going to die. That's how I would rate it. What about you?
I think, you know, one of the best pieces of description that I got about cold exposure was, you know, just being in a cold temperature until you start shivering. Like, that's enough. We don't need hypothermia. We don't need to go that far, but enough to induce shivering if that's the effect that you're going for.
Yeah. And this is very individualized. So for example, someone might start to shiver and feel that, like, oh shit, this is cold at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and someone else might need it to get to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The first cold plunge that I ever did was at 43 degrees Fahrenheit. And that was pretty cold for a first timer, I would say. I didn't really have any control over that, but definitely, like, and I've been in water since then that has been warmer, that I'm like, like, this isn't as difficult for me. And I've been in water that is colder that I'm like, oh my gosh, this is definitely harder. So again, once you start to feel that shiver, I think that's your threshold, and that's how you know, okay, I'm going to start getting some benefits from it.
Yeah, and I've stayed in water that's, I wouldn't consider it cold by any means, but it's 58, 59 degrees Fahrenheit. So basically what's coming out of the tap here at the house. And staying in that longer than 5 minutes, I can get to a point where I'm shivering consistently. And then I know that I've gotten enough exposure and I can get out.
Yeah. When you did your first one, what was that temperature?
Oh gosh, I think, so I did a commercially, basically a spa here in town has an infrared sauna combined with a cold plunge tub. So it's a commercially available tub. And I think that was set to, I want to say 48 degrees the first time I did it.
So cold. Yeah, definitely. I think anything.
I thought I was going to, literally put my toes in and got immediately right back out.
Yep. I know. It's that moment of like, do I commit or not? And sometimes you just have to step out and you're like, I'm not quite ready to do a full body thing, or maybe you have to talk yourself into it again. But as I mentioned earlier too, the breath is huge when it comes to cold water immersion and cold therapy. I mean, if you don't learn to control your breath and you don't practice that beforehand, it can be dangerous and it can be extremely uncomfortable. And that's why when I first did my first cold plunge, we had spent like 3 hours breathing. And it sounds so silly to some people, but there's so much benefit to it, because part of the benefits to cold water exposure and cold therapy is on your breath work. So I want to get into some of those benefits. So the first one that I immediately noticed the more that I started to do this was I was able to control my breath response in stressful situations and not in stressful situations. And if you missed the beginning, what I'm saying is that there's a difference between respirating and breathing. What you're doing right now is respirating. And thank goodness that your body does this automatically. Breathing is a conscious thing that we have to practice. And sometimes we even have to learn how to do it. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, again, we have a breathwork episode on the podcast. It's episode 20. So it's further back. It's almost been a year since I released that. And so you can go back and listen to that. But I really love the benefit of controlling the breath response in cold plunges, because what it's ultimately doing is controlling your adrenaline response. So when you get in that tub and you're really stressed out and you're like, why am I doing this? Have I lost my mind? When you bring yourself back to your breath and you find that breath and you can center around it, that then is training you to be able to handle any other stressful situation that might occur outside of that tub. So when I'm in there and I can control my breath in that stressful but also safe situation, I know that I can handle my breath in any other stressful situation that I encounter later on in my day. And that's what I love about it, is because it's training myself to be able to breathe through the stress, through the anxiety, through the overwhelm. And so I know that if I can sit in a cold tub full of cold water for 3 minutes and breathe through it calmly, then I can certainly handle traffic, right? Right. I can handle, getting in the middle of a heated argument. I can handle feeling like, oh my gosh, someone's mad at me. Or, oh, I messed up. I couldn't.
Or getting on stage.
Right. Getting on stage, recording podcasts, getting on Instagram. Like, those things are nerve-wracking too. But being able to breathe through it, I have that skill set that I know 100% has improved since doing the cold plunges. I don't have any quantifiable data on that, but I just know it and I feel it, and I feel more confident in my ability to handle the stressful situations since doing that. So I love that what it has given me in that way. Again, I think it's huge, especially if you do find yourself being someone who maybe does struggle to breathe through stressful situations, or maybe is very, very reactive and kind of has these knee-jerk reactions to things. Learning to breathe in that cold environment will definitely calm you down and get you, to be in a position where, okay, I know this is stressful. I know this is irritating, but I know I can come back to my breath before I respond. And that's what's really important to me.
Yeah, it's almost like we are intentionally putting ourselves into a situation where we must focus on the breath in order to spend any length of time more than 2 seconds in the cold water. And by doing that, we're training our nervous system, because most of our minutes of our day are spent in some kind of fight or flight, stressful, sympathetic nervous system response to something. And if we can spend 3 minutes in a parasympathetic state, focusing, like what I think about when I'm in the cold water, I focus on controlling my out breath to be consistent and controlled, because if I don't, I'm going to be doing all sorts of shrieking, exhaling, like it's cold. Oh my God. Right. And that is not controlling my nervous system whatsoever. But if I'm really focusing on lengthening out my exhale, that is really going to control the nervous system. So one of my favorite things about doing this is that you're inadvertently double dipping. Not only are you working on breath work, but you're working on nervous system response. You're controlling that adrenaline, norepinephrine response that your body is releasing right now because of the short-term cold exposure.
Right. You're essentially telling your body, I know that you're going through something right now. I know you're feeling it, but we are safe. And that's really huge to be able to get to a point, because like you said, if you're in sympathetic state, fight, flight, or freeze all day long, your body's going to feel like it's always being threatened. And so putting yourself in this quote unquote, stressful, safe spot, you get to train your body that, hey, we can handle these stressful situations. We are fine. We have the tools to get out of it. And the tool is breath. And that's what I really love about it. And that feels so special and so cool that we can do that. We can train ourselves in that way, and we can support our nervous system in that way. So yeah, absolutely. There are situations that I've been in the past year that I probably would have reacted way differently to, but I do feel like I'm able to take that second and say, you know what, I can breathe. My nervous system is not as reactive because I've been training on this. And at the workshop, there was a quote that was shared, and I just love it. And it's by Viktor E. Frankl. And the quote is, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response." And I just love that, because that space of like, oh no, what's happening? It's really cold. You get to choose. And so my choice is always breath. And like you said, it's prolonged, slow, deep breathing. And the same thing outside of the tub. When something happens that's stressful, I'm like, oh no, what am I going to do? Or I really messed this up, or I don't know what to do. I'm like, wait a second, I can choose my response. So again, it's in or out of the tub, I have that same response. And it's all because I've been practicing that. It's like putting reps in at the gym. The more that I've been doing these cold plunges, the better I am at that. And I love that you started talking about the way that you do it. And I think maybe we can talk about that a little bit more, of like the actual breath techniques, maybe when we get to like the how and why to do it, because I think that'll be beneficial too. But yeah, definitely controlling breath, nervous system response is definitely important. Other benefits are, I didn't actually know this until recently, but cold exposure increases brown fat activation, which is a fat storage that assists in warming up the body to burn white fat cells. So this is why when you see people talk about benefits of cold exposure boosting your metabolism, this is what they're talking about. It's that turning on and off of certain fat cells. And so that uptick in the brown fat can help burn more of that adipose tissue that is usually unwanted for most people. So I think that's really cool. I'm not saying this is like all of a sudden you're going to start doing cold plunges and you're going to drop a bunch of weight. There's so many other factors. But I will say that I do think this has helped me a little bit. Just I've noticed some changes in my body, and I think that some of it has to do with some of the cold plunges that I've been doing. And so that's a benefit that I think kind of draws some people in who have never heard of it before. Another really cool one that I wanted to talk about is increasing dopamine. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and that plays a role in how we experience pleasure. So it's also been, it's also known as this chemical messenger. But again, it ultimately comes down to dopamine, whether we have a lot of it or little of it, plays a role in how we're experiencing pleasure in our day-to-day lives. And so some people naturally have higher levels of dopamine than others. And so when you have low levels of dopamine, maybe you don't need as much stimulus to feel good because you have enough, that's your threshold. But if you have too much of it and you start to do something that feels really good, and then your stores go back down, you're going to need more of it. So I was actually listening to a really interesting podcast that explains this way better than me. It was Dr. Andrew Huberman. It was the Huberman Lab podcast. And he was talking about extroverts versus introverts and their dopamine levels. Now, introverts have less dopamine requirements than extroverts do. And so that explains why extroverts are typically going to be people who are seeking out more experience and more things to, kind of fill their bucket, versus people who identify as being an introvert don't need as much because their dopamine receptors and their dopamine storage is already different and pretty much at the level that feels comfortable for them. So again, he explains it way better than me, but I just thought that was so interesting. And I also thought it was interesting that cold plunges and cold therapy also relates to increasing dopamine. So, Toréa, you and I both do Dutch tests. Clients will run Dutch tests and we'll look at them and talk about it. And dopamine is actually a marker on the Dutch test. So this is the hormonal test that we do. And it's actually interesting. I do see that more people are low on dopamine than within range or higher. What about you?
Yeah, I see that a lot. And there's lots of different reasons for why that is. But what's interesting about cold exposure is that it helps really balance out those neurotransmitters, because there's dopamine, there's norepinephrine that gets released when we're put into a cold shock, and that's finger quotes cold shock situation. And there's a lot of studies out there that relate cold exposure therapy to helping boost somebody's mood. And so it doesn't surprise me at all that this is one of the ways that it can be done. And my experience both with the commercial cold plunge and the cold water immersion that I've done here at home, I always feel pretty amazing afterwards. And it reminds me of the days where I do a fairly intense or fairly long endurance bicycle ride. And I've built up all of those, runner's high neurotransmitters that make me feel so good. It's the same stuff.
Yeah, exactly. That first cold plunge I ever did, I feel like I blacked out at not really, but I just feel like I kind of zoned out at one point and was like, just survive. Don't look stupid. You're in front of strangers. Like, just make it through this. And as soon as I got out of there, I was like, is this what it feels like to like be high? Like, I was high on life. And I'm telling you, like, I was high on life for hours. Like, that was the best I had felt in a really, really, really long time. And I think that's what made me so intrigued, because it carried on into that evening. I slept amazingly. And in my Oura ring, it tracks your resting heart rate overnight. And my resting heart rate had lowered hours before it usually had. And because I was someone who my heart rate, unfortunately, would lower like right as I was supposed to wake up. So that's, showing signs of adrenal issues, but that's another episode. But it had decreased like hours earlier. And so I'm like, well, that's interesting. And then I woke up and I felt good. And I was also just feeling proud of myself. I mean, that's an aspect of it too, is you just feel proud of, look at what I just did. Like, that's really hard stuff. And I just did that really well. So that feels good. But absolutely, that high that you get when you get out of that tub is just, it's amazing. Like, as we're talking about it, I'm like, I think I need to do a plunge tomorrow.
Yeah, really exactly. I'm having the same thoughts. It's like, I need some cold water. Yeah. But yeah, that feeling is pretty amazing. I think it's amazing to me because it doesn't dissipate right away. Sometimes, like with dopamine, I think about getting quote unquote dopamine hits when you're scrolling through Instagram and pulling down and getting a refresh or checking for new mail. That's all dopamine hit driven behavior. That's us seeking another dose of dopamine, but it's gone in an instant. And so this having that effect last for hours afterward is a pretty extraordinary thing. And, it's one of those things that, there is some pride in it, because what we're talking about, it's hard. It takes some courage. It takes some real mental control to not feel the experiences that you're feeling on the skin necessarily. That's what I'm thinking about. And want to get out right away, right? You're resisting that urge so that you can put yourself in a temporarily uncomfortable situation so that you can get all these health benefits afterwards. Yeah. It's pretty amazing.
It makes you feel proud of yourself and makes you feel like, well, hey, like if I did that, then I can do this other thing that's really intimidating or really hard or going to be uncomfortable. So I like, again, it's that transfer of in the tub life and then out of the tub life. I just love that there's that crossover there. And yeah, I mean, every time I've done the cold plunge, I get out and I'm immediately smiling. Like, I'm usually doing it with a friend or like, something like that. And we'll be filming it because I like to show these things on Instagram and stuff. And every time I get out, I'm cheesing afterwards. It's just like this gigantic smile. This feels so good. And it's like this like almost lightheadedness, but not like scary lightheadedness. It's just this free, light feeling. And yeah. So if you're listening and now I think you understand why I'm addicted. And I think I've just proved it here the way that I'm talking about it. But yes, so love it. But there's that. There's also a couple other benefits we wanted to go over. And Toréa, if you don't mind, could you explain some of the benefits on insulin sensitivity and also immune cells?
Yeah. So let's talk about insulin sensitivity and blood sugar. So what we see in the studies with cold exposure therapy is that we're starting to see, you kind of hinted at it a little bit, it's activating that brown fat activity, right? And so that is increasing our insulin sensitivity, which is a good thing. We want to be insulin sensitive. We don't want to be numbed out to insulin and not have it do its thing and then the body pump out more and more and more. That's what leads to prediabetes and diabetes and metabolic disease. So it increases our insulin sensitivity, but it also causes our cells to uptake glucose much more efficiently when we are doing cold exposure therapy. And because I'm such a data head and love collecting data and love any kind of biometric device that I can get my hands on to collect that kind of data. I've been wearing a continuous glucose monitor now for a number of months. And, the learnings that I've gotten out of it in terms of what I eat and when I eat, that's great. I love that part. But here's what I've noticed both in the short term and in the long term doing cold exposure therapy. So when I get into the cold tub, I will notice a distinct drop in my circulating blood glucose. Now, granted, this is interstitial glucose, so it's a slightly different measurement, but we still see the drop. We see this drop in the glucose. And so that is showing me that the cells are uptaking the free circulating glucose remarkably. And then it kind of recovers. But then over the long haul, what I've noticed is instead of having a lot of like peaks and valleys throughout the day and larger responses to meals and that kind of thing, it's now a lot more even keel. So it's within a zone. It doesn't, like, my meals aren't spiking nearly as high. My dips aren't coming nearly as low as they used to. So it's definitely like leveled that out. So now I'm super curious and I want to get a A1C measurement done and compare the before and after. Because the last time I did my A1C, it was below it was in the good range, right? Just below the warning range. So that was good. Thumbs up. But now I want to see the effect of what it's done to that.
Yes, that's so cool. I love that you have that instant feedback, because that has always intrigued me. Because I've shared before that I went through periods of having higher glucose levels. And that was always concerning to me, because I know that this is something definitely lifestyle. I mean, I don't have type 1 diabetes. And so I knew that this was more lifestyle diet related, and also hormonally related and all those things too. But, I will say that there are other things that I've done to support my glucose and have proper, like walking after meals and adding more protein and all that stuff. But my glucose has stabilized. And again, I can't say exactly that it's all because of cold water immersion, but I'm not going to say that it's not related to that at all. I think I'm glad that you brought that up and you have that actual data in the moment to share. So I think that's really, really cool. And again, that's another argument to try it, especially if you are someone who struggles with, having wonky blood sugar levels or inconsistency with that.
Yeah. And then on the immune standpoint, and reviewing different studies that are out there, of course, studies can kind of go back and forth between mouse model studies and human studies and that kind of thing. But the summary data is really starting to show that cold exposure can cause certain portions of our immune system to create more cells of those types. So things like CD25 lymphocytes and white blood cells and T lymphocytes, the cytotoxic version, which we want those. Those are going to kill off cancer cells, if it's getting started. So we want those kinds of T lymphocytes, natural killer cells. All of those increase with regular periodic exposure to cold. And we also know that it will lower inflammation. So it's a really profound way to lower inflammation. And in fact, it's used a lot in athletics, right? As a way to recover when we do an extreme, not necessarily extreme, but an intense workout. We're really generating a lot of inflammation. So the body has to then go into an immediate recovery cycle to repair that damage. That cold exposure can help after a workout to bring down that inflammation. So we are seeing a lot of different ways in the scientific literature that cold exposure, when done on a regular basis, can have a profound impact on how our immune system functions, how autoimmune conditions are developing or not developing or reversing, et cetera, with all of these different aspects. So I love that part.
Yes. Yeah. So again, so many arguments to at least try it. We're going to go into more detail on these in the Wildly Optimized Wellness podcast episode. So feel free, again, jump over to that one if it's been released by the time you listen to it. If you're listening to this episode on its release date or week, you have a couple weeks to wait for that one. That one will be out on May 5th. So again, we're going to continue this conversation in terms of benefits over on that one and tie into a little bit more nature and things like that. But now I want to switch over to talking about cold water immersion, which means being in water, like immersing yourself in water. So getting in a cold plunge, getting an ice bath versus cold showers and cryotherapy. So before I even got into a cold plunge, I had always experimented with ending my showers with cold water. So I would maybe halfway through, I'd turn the dial a little bit and then it'd get cold and then I'd be like shivering and then I'd turn it a little bit more and then I'd start shivering more. And so that was my first kind of little exposure to it. And people ask, like, is that the same? And the answer is not really, but it's not completely not the same either, because ending your showers or doing cold showers can certainly activate some of those properties, but it's not going to be the same as doing a complete immersion in the tub. So that's something that I think is important to differentiate. Is it's not the exact same as dunking yourself in cold water for 3 to 4 minutes a few times a week. And then
you're not going to be fully exposed to the water. Like if you think about a shower, right? Most of us have our back to the faucet and we only have a portion of our body that's getting exposed to cold, whereas the rest is being exposed to air. And when you're in a full immersion, you're not really escaping it. Maybe with the exception of hands or feet and your neck, right? But you're not really escaping it. So it's a lot more efficient, I think, in the way that it works when we're doing the full water immersion.
Yeah. And I personally feel more annoyed doing cold water, like in my shower, than I do getting in the tub. Because it's just annoying because it starts to pitter patter everywhere. And you're just like, just be cold or not. Because I don't know, that's just my personal experience is when I do that, I'm like, it's just as irritating to me. I'd rather just get into a cold tub. But I don't know, maybe that's just me. So
I have a different problem with the showers. I tend to cheat. It's like, oh my God, it's cold. Turn it back up, right? Because I have access to the temperature control. So right. Total cheater.
That's true. That's true. And same thing goes for cryotherapy. So that, I feel like cryotherapy got really popular and mainstream before cold plunges did. Because now I feel like cold plunges, a lot of people are doing them, talking about them. But cryotherapy, I had heard about that for a long time before I even explored doing cold plunges. In terms of mainstream, I mean, I know they've been around and people have used them and they've been like in sports and things like that. But I can't personally speak to doing cryotherapy because I've never done it. But I do know that there's a difference between immersion in cold water versus the cryo chamber. And most people that I've talked to that have done both actually say that cryotherapy is a lot easier than cold water immersion. So doing a cold plunge or ice bath. So Toréa, why is that? What is the difference that happens in cold water immersion versus cryotherapy in terms of body heat, things like that?
I think it has a lot to do with the way that the temperature transfers. So when we're looking at different materials and how quickly that temperature thermogenesis occurs, that temperature transfer happens much more rapidly in water than it does in air. And so granted, when you're in a cryotherapy chamber, like the numbers that they use just sound like freakishly cold, right? And they have to have it that cold to be able to counteract the issue with air being something like 25 times less efficient than water in that way. So, I think it has a lot to do with that. Just like if you think about a large body of water, the ocean, for example, because there's so much temperature that's stored in the ocean that's colder, it has an actual effect on the land and the microclimates around the water. So anytime you're closer to water, those temperatures near the coast or near the large body of water usually are going to be cooler than something further inland. It's the same kind of thing. So I think it's just a lot more efficient.
Yeah. And we were talking before we recorded, another way to think about it is our body heat is going to be lost a lot more quicker in water compared to like just being in air. So, kind of condensed version of that is just think about that as your body temperature is going to decrease a lot faster if you are in really cold water compared to being in really cold air. And I mean, I feel that we're just barely coming out of winter here in Ohio. And so we've had many, many cold days. And I definitely feel like I can tolerate the cold better, but it's when it's like 11 degrees Fahrenheit outside, it's not like I feel the way that I do when I'm sitting in 30-degree water or, 40-degree water. So there's definitely a difference there.
Yeah, if you think about, wind chill factor, right? And you're in a moist, cold environment like the eastern seaboard, that is going to feel so much colder than if you're in a drier environment like Colorado. The temperature on the scale might be the same, but it's going to feel so different because there's less moisture in the air. And that moisture in the air is acting as that thermal conductivity, so to speak, and making it happen much faster.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So I figured that was the case, but when we were looking it up and, looking to research and then talking to a couple friends who have done both, they've all said like, yeah, cryo chamber is hard. It's uncomfortable, but it's definitely not as bad as doing like a cold plunge. So another thing that I wanted to share, I briefly noted, is I do feel this is a benefit for me personally. I do feel like I've been able to tolerate winter a lot better than I would have, or than I have in all the years that I've been alive. This past winter, we definitely had cold days and just, grueling winds and things like that. And I just wasn't as miserable. I mean, don't get me wrong. I still get affected by like seasonal affect disorder, and I still get, bummed out with the winter and being gray and dark and all that. But it didn't feel as horrible, and it didn't feel as torturous for me to be in the winter. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that I can tolerate cold a lot better. So I'm really thankful for that too.
Yeah. The body has a really wonderful way of adapting to different environments. And if you're doing something like cold water immersion or cold water therapy, of cold exposure therapy of any kind, your body's going to become habituated to that cold. And it's not going to feel nearly as shocking as it would if you're used to warm temperatures all the time.
Yeah. Definitely. I feel that. And I think that other people who are doing these more frequently also feel that too. So what I want to finish up with is getting into the practical how and why, or how and when. So there's, research that shows, different times of the day are better than other times of day. And the ones that I've found, and what I truly believe too, again, me just kind of being my own person, is it is recommended to be doing cold exposure in the first half of your day. And the reason for that is because if we think about the adrenaline, norepinephrine response that's happening, that's a lot for your body to go through and then to come back down from as well. So coming back down from that might take a little bit of time. And so if you do that earlier in your day, you have less chances of it influencing your sleep at night or interfering with your sleep, right? So if I were to get all hopped up and, get into a cold plunge and get really cold and like wired and all that and feel really good, and then I try to go to bed an hour later, that's going to be really hard for me to come back down because my body is still trying to work through that dopamine release that we talked about. So that is personally what I do. I prefer to do it earlier in the day if possible. Like there was one weekend where I actually just did it like within the first 10 minutes of waking, and that certainly woke me up and I was really wired for a few hours. But again, I love it. So that would be my recommendation. Again, it's not like you're doing anything wrong by doing it later in the day. It's just, I think if you could control it, you could, try to do it earlier and see if that has any effect on you. Another benefit too is a lot of people will do cold exposure paired with like saunas and, hot exposure. And I've done that too. And what I've personally chosen to do is I prefer to do hot first if I can't go back and forth. Like Toréa, you had done back and forth a few times at this place that you went to. But I prefer if I only can do one at a time and that's it, I will do hot first and then cold after. And the reason for that is because it's people are like, oh, it's because you're warmed up, so the cold won't feel as cold. No, I don't feel that way. I actually feel like it's worse getting into that cold plunge after you've been hot. But I will say that I prefer for my body to work harder to heat back up after the cold on its own versus if I do cold therapy and then I go jump into a sauna, my body has assistance in heating back up. And I know that my body is getting a lot of benefits of cold by having to work hard to heat back up to its temperature. So I'd rather do it on its own because I feel like that's activating more of those properties and healing properties of the cold exposure versus assisting it by sitting into a sauna. So Not everyone has to do that. Not everyone wants to do that. Some people would rather go sit in the sauna because they're like, I just want as much help as possible heating back up. Totally fine. That's just how I've been doing it.
Yep.
How was that for you to go back and forth? And do you think that you have a preference on doing hot first or cold first or vice versa?
What I was doing is called contrast therapy. So you get into a hot sauna, and then you get into a cold plunge for a couple minutes, and then you rinse and repeat a number of times, usually 3, maybe 4 times if you have a full hour to do it. I think I prefer either doing contrast therapy. So if I had the setup at home, I totally would do it. But I don't have that setup at home. But I like the contrast therapy because it makes the cold plunge feel easier in a way, because I'm a little bit warmer. So when I get in there, there's less of that like sheer shock. It's almost like there's a buffer there and it's not quite as shocking. And then I know psychologically, oh, I can do this for a few minutes and then I get to go right back into the sauna, so for a mental standpoint, it was a lot more motivating to do it that way. Contrast therapy is used a lot in reducing inflammation and that kind of thing. So I had signed myself up for a couple sessions because I had a minor injury and I wanted to make sure that I was keeping inflammation under control and healing in the healing process of that. Since then, I've been migrating and trying to reproduce the same effect using my home bathtub through various not so successful attempts, but I can get 59-degree water to come out of the tap here. I don't know how long I'll be able to keep that because, of course, we're going into summer and it probably won't stay that way. But being able to get into a 59-degree tub and then stay in there for 5 to 8 minutes and get to that point of shivering, that also achieves the same effect. So I'm able to do it that way. But I guess if I had my choice, I would definitely go from hot to cold and then allow my body to heat up naturally, like you said, because I think that like euphoric effect and also the metabolic effect, like I've experienced getting out of that cold plunge, not being able to go into the sauna afterwards because my session was up, and then getting into my clothes and then shivering for like 45 minutes, right? it's not like a full on shiver, but there's like little shiver episodes that happen for about 45 minutes afterwards. So I know my body is working really hard to heat itself back up. So yeah, if that helps with metabolism, I'm all for it.
Right. I'm like, I'll take it. I'm not complaining, but yeah. Another thing in terms of how and when is, the literature shows that 11 minutes a week has been found to be enough time to activate health benefits. So if you think 11 minutes per week, that could be 3 to 4 sessions of 3 to 4 minutes at a time. The longest I've ever sat in there is 4 minutes. They say not to go above 5. So some people do push it past that. And I just don't want to mess with that. There's no reason for me to be doing that. I feel comfortable and safe at no more than 4. But I've done anything from 3 to 4. The first one I ever did was 3 minutes, and then I worked my way up to 4. But again, that's about 3 to 4 times a week of doing 3 to 4 minutes. So it's really not time consuming in that way either. When you put it in that way of 11 minutes a week and you get all those benefits, like I think that's really, really cool.
Why not?
And yeah, exactly. Why not? So that's something that I've been aiming for. I haven't been consistent with it, but that's something that I talk about a lot. Is it's okay to want to do things and not be 100% there yet. I think that's totally fine. It's on my list and I will get there. And so I will continue to work on that. But again, 11 minutes does not feel intimidating. In terms of how I do it, well, how, we could do it. So, I've been to a place in Columbus, Ohio, Ebb and Float. That's where I first did my first one. And we did the workshop on everything and I got exposed to it there. So you can find a place that has the cold plunge, and it's literally called the cold plunge. Like that's the most well-known one. You could also get a horse trough, which is what I did. So I was not going to spend $5,000 on the cold plunge at this point in my life to have at my house. And so I decided to buy that. So I went to the Tractor Supply store.
I love it.
I got one of the horse troughs and came back and filled it up with water and ice. And it's perfect. It's 100 gallons. A lot of people ask, like, what size did you get? It's 100 gallons. And what I like about it too is that I can use it, 2-3 times, and I feel comfortable with that. I'm in there just for a bit. You can shower beforehand if you want to try and be as hygienic as possible if you're going to be reusing water. But I like that because, again, if you fill it up overnight and it is cold overnight, then maybe you don't even need ice the next morning, depending on how cold it has gotten. I was doing that in the winter of filling it up at night. Temperatures would get down to like 16 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. So I jump in the morning and it was like, probably 35 degree water. So you could try that. Or, you could try filling up your bathtub, which Toréa has some experience with.
I have a lot of experimenting with my bathtub. Yeah.
Yeah. Which, probably not the best thing for some people. And you also have to make sure your tub is deep enough because you want to get as much as your body immersed too. Like my bathtub is not luxurious or
you really need
deep.
A soaking tub. So like the average volume of a soaking tub is about 100 gallons, right?
Yeah.
It's somewhere between 80 to 100 gallons. And so if you've got a shallower tub, you can do it, but you're going to be like sinking way down into it to get fully covered.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can do it.
Yeah. So there's that. Another thing, which again, we're going to talk more in depth on in the Wildly Optimized Wellness podcast episode is, doing this outside in like a stream or just in nature. And I'm really excited about that because, side note, Toréa and I are going to be doing that together later this year. Because
yes.
you want to go into, what that means.
We are planning a live in-person retreat, and part of that experience is going to take women out into the wilderness. And so why not use an alpine lake to do a cold plunge experience? So yeah, we're both very excited to do that experience together.
Yeah, definitely. It'll be cool because we're kind of doing it on our own separately, but we keep, checking in on each other and sharing our successes with it. And so it'll be nice to do it together and also outside because that's the whole point of, especially Wildly Optimized Wellness, is getting more people outside to try these things. So,
Evie, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
When you fill up your horse trough, how many bags of ice do you use? Because I went on the other geeky science end and actually calculated the thermogenesis of reducing the temperature of water with ice to try and figure out how much ice I would need to put in my bathtub. So I'm curious how much you use.
So it depends on the temperature outside. So in the summertime, when I first got the horse trough, I was putting in 2 or 3 bags, and I don't know what the size bags are. I can't remember how many.
The big or the small?
Big. So
okay, big. Yeah.
2 of those, and it wasn't cold enough. It probably got to like 52 degrees, and so for me, that's not cold enough. But then in the wintertime, like in January, I did one, and I used 2 bags of ice, same size, big bags, and the water had gotten down to like 38. So again, it was already cold outside. I had let the water cool down overnight. So, but yeah, I'd say heading into spring and summer for me here in Ohio, I'll probably need 2 to 3 bags to get it uncomfortably cold for me.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I was calculating, thermodynamics is always a complex math calculation and trying to figure out how much would it take to cool 100 gallons of water in a soaking tub, 10 degrees. And the calculations came down to 4 bags of ice.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But that's 10 full degrees. So that's a lot of degrees that we're changing. And we would need 4 bags of ice, which would probably fill up half of the bathtub almost. So I wouldn't have to use nearly so much water. So I don't know. There's some playing around with it. But we giggle and laugh because my experiments here at home, I have emptied out the ice maker of the fridge. I've taken every single, those packets that you get in packages that are refreezable ice. I took every single one of them I had. Like I had 2-gallon, plastic bags full of them from the freezer, dumped all those in the bathtub and maybe moved the temperature 2 degrees. So it's not quite enough. So now I just stick with my 59 degrees tepid cold water immersion and just stay in longer. Seems to work just fine. Yeah.
Again, back to what we were saying in the beginning, just get to that shivering point. right? And if that means, and if you're using warmer temperatures, you can probably stay in longer than like the 5 minutes that I was saying. Like if you're in warmer temperature, you're going to be fine to stay in. It's more of like, if you were absolutely shivering for more than 5 minutes, that's where it's like, okay, well, we need to, we need to question if this is safe at this point. So, yeah, but those are kind of the tips. And again, it's, I don't want to say it's not complicated. It is, you have to think a little bit of like, am I doing it at home? Am I going to try and find a place? Am I going to get one of those? They have like, they kind of just look like wine barrels or something that you can also get in. What are those called?
Oh gosh, what was it called? The ice barrel, I think is what it's called. And it looks like a wine barrel. It's made of plastic and it's like $1,000. And I was like, nope. Not doing that. No. I don't know how much my horse trough was, but it was not $1,000. Perfect.
I mean, it takes up a lot of room, but that was fine for me. It was either that or $5,000. And so I decided to go with that for now. But yeah, so just some practical tips on that. So that's really what I wanted to cover in this episode, because I've talked so much about cold plunges, ice baths, and I share so much about it. And I share my love for it on my social media. And I felt like I needed to do an episode on it for the podcast. And I wanted to have you on because you're into it now. And so I just love having this collaboration and being able to support each other in this way. So for everyone listening, I hope that this was helpful, useful, also maybe answered some questions that you might have when you see me jumping into some cold water, like there she goes again. Now you understand why I love it and why I am addicted to it and why I want to continue using this as a health modality for myself, because I've seen great benefits from it in the year that I've been doing it. And I think that the more people that can get into it and do it comfortably and safely, the better. So hopefully this was helpful. If you have any questions or want any further information on the facts that we shared, check out the show notes for that. And Toréa, I want to thank you for spending time with me today, going over this and sharing your love for cold plunges as well.
You bet. Stay cold.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Again, be sure to check out the episode on Wildly Optimized Wellness. We're going to dive deeper into some of the benefits and how to do cold water immersion therapy. So check that out. All right, everyone. Hope you have a great week.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. I so appreciate your interest in holistic health and hope you learned something you can apply to your own life. References from this episode are linked in the show notes, as well as links to find me, Evie, on social media platforms. If you'd like to learn more about services from Holistically Restored, click on the link in the show notes. I'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this content, I encourage you to subscribe and also leave a review on Apple Podcast. Until next time, be well, my friends.